So every week I send out an all-church email and wonder if anybody ever reads those. Sometimes I think, well, maybe my mom and my wife, not even sure about them. But this last week I sent out an email that really seemed to strike a chord with quite a few people, and it had to do with Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga is kind of the poster child for a lot of people who consider themselves misfits, or people who kind of think of themselves as out there on the edges, because she talks very openly about that. And in the piece that I sent out, I talked about the fact that when she was in high school, there were guys who would take her and they would hold her over the trash can, and they would tease her and they would bully her. And there were also girls who were bullies, and they would come by right there in the neighborhood, very close to where she lived, and they would look at her as if to say, "What are you going to do, cry? Or, man, you are so pathetic." And she said, I covered my anxiety with kind of a nervous giggle because I was so wounded and so hurt by that. And so she's become somebody that a lot of people resonate with because they feel like they're on the outside looking in. They feel like they're misfits. They feel like they're outcasts. And when I wrote that, I got a lot of different responses. Let me share just a few with you. People wrote back. One person said, there are so many people who feel so judged and outcast by their peers, families, and community because of criticism. They often turn their back on the Lord because others use Christianity to shame them, leaving them alone without His true love. They need people to love them the way He loves us, faults and all. The damaged messages left by humans are hard to erase from memory. They replay over and over again. You're right. There needs to be more champions of the misfits, walking and ministering the way Jesus truly did. Somebody else wrote, I was a teacher and frequently had students who struggled to fit in. I wanted to make sure each student left my classroom with a sense of purpose and direction. I prayed over desks. I encouraged and loved my students. For those who teach as Christ's ambassadors, the hope is to make a lasting impact on every student. And then somebody else said, it's sometimes easier for us to love the sick, the poor, etc., but then so easy to judge the morally broken, as you called them. Yet the morally broken, which we all are often so broken because of their deep pain. They need us to listen to them, pray with them, and minister to their pain. We can love without condemnation and without compromising our own Christian beliefs. And when I read those responses and I thought about what Lady Gaga had said and how people find this way of identifying with her, I thought a lot this week about how Jesus related to people. And I also thought a lot about how we often feel shunned and left out. You ever have that experience? Maybe you can think back to a time when, captains for the team were appointed and then they're making their choices. Maybe it's on the ball field or maybe in the office. There's team building exercises going on. And so you got these captains and they're choosing. I choose you, I choose you, I choose you, I choose you. And you're sitting there wondering, will I ever be chosen? Or maybe will I be the last one chosen? And there's this punch in your gut that just leaves you feeling so wounded and so hurt and so empty. It's a really, really painful thing, isn't it? And if you feel that way today, one of the things I want you to know is that Christ is seeking you. He's searching for you. He's looking for you. And He's inviting you. And He's welcoming you. And He wants you to know that being part of His community, being on His team, has absolutely nothing with making the cut or qualifying. It's all just a matter of Jesus qualifying you. All you got to do is just jump in. He's just inviting you. See, Jesus invites people who often feel left out. He reaches out to people who often feel left out. He reaches out to people who are often typically on the edges. And He wants you and me to reach out to people who feel like they're left out. In Romans 15, verse 7, Jesus says, or Paul says, accept one another, therefore, as Christ has accepted you. How did Christ accept you? Did He expect you to jump through all these hoops? No. He just accepted you, warts and all. He said, I love you. I care about you. I want you to know that you are welcome. And that's really what a church without walls is all about. That's what we're trying to be. We're trying to be the kind of church that reaches out to people who typically feel like they're left out there on the edges, left on the outside. Now, to do that, there's a great example in Jesus' life, so many great examples, but in Luke chapter 5, there's one particular example I want to call your attention to today. Luke chapter 5 consists of a series of calling stories. Jesus is just calling people to be his disciples. He's calling people to consist of the nucleus of this brand new community. And there is a guy who might be labeled the least likely leader in the kingdom of God. A guy that was absolutely despised. And before I share his story with you, I want you to write down this sentence. It's really simple, but this is the thrust of what I want you to get today. Jesus, listen now, Jesus calls us to reach out to people who are on the edges. He calls us to reach out to people who are on the edges. I want to call your attention to Luke chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. After this, Luke says, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting in his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now this is Levi. He's also known as Matthew, better known as Matthew. In fact, this morning I likely will refer to him occasionally as Matthew. Give me some grace because that's how he's best known. But Levi is a tax collector. He is probably the wealthiest man in town, also the most hated man in town. When the Pharisees and the teachers of the law saw a tax collector coming, they would spit in his direction. They absolutely despised tax collectors. And why is that? Well, first of all, tax collectors were co-conspirators with Rome. See, the Jews hated the Roman occupation of Israel. They hated that, and they especially hated paying taxes to Rome. And here is Levi. He is a Jew who is collecting taxes from his fellow Jews and turning that money over to Rome. So he's considered to be a traitor. He is a turncoat. He is a collaborator with Rome, and Rome is absolutely hated. But it's not just the fact that he is a turncoat, it's also the fact that he overcharges people. The tax collectors would overcharge people, and then they would skim off the top, and then they would take that money and pocket that and line their own pockets with that extortion money. So he's not only a turncoat and a traitor, he's a thief. I mean, he is hated by the Jews. And then Jesus has the audacity to come along and say, "Hey, Levi, come and follow me." And the text says he left everything and followed him. I mean, he grabs his coat, he takes his keys, he locks up his office, he never comes back. And I want you to realize just how radical that was. You know, we read about the fishermen, Peter and Andrew and James and John, leaving their nets full of fish. And that was a big deal for them to leave everything and follow Christ. But they could also reverse that decision. They could go back later on if they chose to, but not Levi. Once he walks out, man, he has burned his bridges. Once he scoots, that's the last opportunity he's going to have to be a tax collector. Rome will never again allow him to function in that way. So he walks away from it all. And you might think that this guy who has lost all of his revenue, all of his source of income, he has no prospect for any more income, you might think he's concerned about spending money. You might think he's concerned about his budget, but he throws this big bash. He throws this huge banquet for all of his tax collector buddies, all these guys who are cheating people, all these people are out there extorting money. And when he creates this banquet, when he creates this party, man, this results in absolute chaos. I want you to think about who's there. Jesus is there. Levi is there. All of his tax collector buddies are there. But right there on the edge of the house, just outside the house, are the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, according to Luke, are mumbling. It's the word gagudzo. It's the word that's found in Numbers chapter 14 to describe when the people of Israel were mumbling against Moses. It's gagudzo. Just say those words with me for just a minute. Gagudzo, gagudzo, gagudzo. You guys are a bunch of whiners, aren't you? It sounds like griping and grumbling and grousing. That's what these people do. Because you see, they refuse to accept the fact that Jesus is accepting toward the tax collectors and the sinners. And the Pharisees believed the more spiritual you were, the greater your circle of outcasts. So they would exclude people on the basis of ethnicity, the Gentiles. They excluded people on the basis of gender. They excluded the women. They excluded people on the basis of their physical condition. They excluded the lepers. They excluded people on the basis of their occupation, what they called the despised trades, like tax collecting and trash collecting and pigeon keeping. They hated all that. And so they come to Jesus and they say, "Why do you eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And I love Jesus' response. This is the genius of Jesus. He says, well, hey, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. As if to say, can you imagine a doctor who would post a sign on his office saying, "No health problems allowed here"? Or a dentist who might hang on a sign that says, "No cavities, please." Or an eye doctor who says, "If you got great vision, you can come see me, otherwise you're not allowed." Or a restaurant that posts a sign that says, "No hungry people." But you know, sometimes that's almost the way Christians treat others. It's kind of like, well, if you're not squeaky clean, if you don't have it all together, if you got any warts in your life. And so Jesus, I want you to understand that you're called to reach out to the tax collectors and to the sinners. And this is what Jesus does all the way through the Gospel of Luke. You know, this is not an anomaly. You go back to the beginning of Luke chapter 5, he calls the fishermen, Peter and Andrew and James and John, these guys who are really, they got a lot of rough edges in their lives. And then he heals a leper. You remember the leper was an outcast. He was the ultimate misfit. Leviticus chapter 13 said that the leper had to walk through the streets of the city covering his upper lip saying, "Unclean, unclean," so people would scatter out of the way. And then you come to Luke chapter 7. This time it's a prostitute, a woman with a horrible reputation. She's been sleeping around, and she goes to the house of Simon the Pharisee, and what does Jesus do? He just sits there, and she anoints his feet with her tears, and she dries his feet with her hair. And then Luke chapter 10, Jesus' great story of the Good Samaritan. Who's the hero? It's the Samaritan, the guy who is despised by the people. And then Luke chapter 14, you've got Jesus saying, when you have a banquet, invite the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. Don't invite the people who can reciprocate. Invite the people who are not in a position to reciprocate. And then you have Luke chapter 19, where Jesus goes not just to the house of a tax collector, he goes to the house of Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector. He is the head honcho of the IRS. But so often, even though Jesus is reaching out to all these wrong kinds of people, Christians specialize in separation. We got Christian schools and Christian artists and Christian concerts and Christian yellow pages and Christian this and Christian that. And sometimes, maybe unwittingly, we almost send the message, man, you could never, have any contact with somebody who curses, or, somebody who does this or does that, or somebody who has a different political point of view. But is that really what Jesus wants? See, Jesus wants us to be in the world, but not of the world. And he talked to his disciples about that. He really left this message for all of us in John 17, verse 14. "I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified." What does it mean to be in the world but not of the world? Well, being in the world, first of all, means mixing it up with other sinners. In Matthew 11, verse 19, Jesus quoted the words that were being spoken about him by other people. He said, people are saying, "Here is a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of sinners." Now, Jesus was not a glutton and he wasn't a drunkard, but he was a friend of sinners. And if you're reading in a lot of translations, you're going to find that phrase, sinners, in quotation marks. What that means is the Pharisees and the teachers of the law considered anybody to be a sinner who didn't observe the law of Moses and all the traditions of Moses as scrupulously as they did. And so they become outcasts, these sinners. But you got to mix it up with people who are sinners just like you and me, the wrong kinds of people. And then being in the world means going to the places where other sinners are. Going to the places where other sinners are. Think about it. Jesus doesn't say to Levi, now I'm going to meet you in an out-of-the-way place where nobody's going to know that we're getting together. He goes right to his house. Now, I understand there's a need for discretion. You know, if you struggle with alcohol, the last place in the world you need to be is in a place where alcohol is being served. And we as Christians need to protect our reputation, and we need to protect other people who may have different kinds of vulnerabilities. But where are you going to meet unchurched people? Not going to meet them at church most of the time. So we got to go to the places where sinners are, other sinners are, and then not being in the world means separating from the things the world loves. 1 John 2, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. John says there are two different ways to live. You can live of the world, you can live with the value system of the world, or you can choose to live for God. You live for eternal things, or you live for temporary things. You live for yourself, or you live an unselfish life. I like what Tom Hovestol says about how Jesus came to be so adored by people who were rejected by religion. First, Jesus took the initiative. Jesus invited himself, actually, to Levi's house. My hunch is that's the first time this has ever happened in Levi's life. Second, Jesus was willing to interact on Levi's turf. He gave up the home court advantage. Third, he wasn't repulsed by sinners. Fourth, he genuinely liked folks that religious people loathed. And finally, he was always completely himself. He wasn't into image management. Jesus was authentic. He was real. But you know, why did the Pharisees and the teachers of the law ostracize others that they considered to be undesirables? Well, it's because their concept really was, they thought, if you're going to be pure, you've got to be separate. In fact, that's what the word Pharisee means. It means separate. But Jesus says that's a false choice. They're not mutually exclusive. You can hold on to godly values and still mix it up with people who are out there in the world. I love this quote from Robert Munger. Listen to what he says. The church is the only fellowship in the world where the one requirement for membership is the unworthiness of the candidate. Don't you love that? The only fellowship in the world where the one requirement for membership is the unworthiness of the candidate. You think about David's mighty men in 1 Samuel chapter 22. David is a king without a kingdom. He's being chased by Saul. He has to take refuge in a cave. He has no place to go. Saul's trying to hunt him down and kill him. But 1 Samuel 22 verse 2 says that these 400 guys come to him. He says, those who were distressed, those who were in debt, and those who were discontented. Sounds like a bunch of losers, doesn't it? But these misfits become David's mighty men. These zeros become God's heroes. Neil Cole lists the reasons we need to start with people who desperately need Christ. Number one, desperate sinners will hold on to Christ because their lives depend on it. Number two, desperate sinners will see their lives change more readily than those who are already doing well. Number three, desperate sinners are more likely to confess their sin because it's more obvious. Number four, desperate sinners will become walking and talking billboards to other desperate sinners. That's exactly what Levi is. He invites all of his buddies. They come. He's a billboard. Number five, desperate sinners usually have more strategic contact with other desperate sinners who need Jesus. Number six, desperate sinners are the very reason Jesus came and died. He delights to save them. And finally, number seven, desperate sinners who are transformed by the gospel bring greater glory to God because it makes the miraculous that much more manifest. Only God could do such a miracle. Did you notice verse 32? Jesus said, I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Well, what does that mean? The so-called righteous people very often don't even have their need for righteousness on their radar. They don't see their need because they're so pompous and so arrogant and so self-assured that they forget they need the righteousness that comes only from Christ. Sick people know their need for medicine. And when these tax collectors and sinners come to the table in the clinic, Jesus is not about to turn them away. He's going to welcome them. He's going to accept them. He's going to love them. And you think about it, he spends time with Matthew for the next year, and then the next 2.5 years, he is including Levi or Matthew in this little coterie of disciples, becoming one of the 12 apostles, and then they launch this revolution that changes the world. And not only that, but Matthew writes one of the 4 Gospels. I mean, think about that. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. Years ago, I went through a personal crisis where I was super depressed, and I felt like crying most of the time. And I walked into a counselor's office, and there was a little thing that somebody had just posted on a bulletin board, and it said this: "If this is not a place where tears are understood, where can I go to cry? And if this is not a place where my spirit can take wing, where can I go to fly? And if this is not a place where questions can be asked, where can I go to seek? And if this is not a place where my heart cry can be voiced, where can I go to speak?" That's what the church has to be. Where do you turn when the bottom drops out of your life? Where do you turn when your mate is talking separation or divorce? Where do you turn when your daughter's run away for the 4th time and you're afraid she's pregnant? Where do you turn when you've lost your job and it's your fault? Where do you turn when you're in jail because you broke the law? You need to be able to turn to the church. See, when people are acting their worst, that's when they need love the most, but that's also when it's most difficult to love them. But until we love people and love each other when we are unlovable, there's no way we will ever break the reverberating cycle of hate in this world. And accepting people is not license. You know, when a Christian, when a believer continues in sin, we challenge that, right? I mean, the Bible talks about it in Colossians 3 and verse 16. "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another." We challenge each other. There's a difference between making judgments and being judgmental. Dallas Willard talks about the fact that in the church we've got to be ready to challenge each other. We've got to be willing to hold each other accountable. But there is a way to do that without attacking a person's worth. Well, when's the last time you held a Levi party? You know, when's the last time you invited unchurched people into your home? Or you got with people who, you might think of as having some rough edges. How many unchurched people do you know? What kind of neighbor are you being to people who are unchurched? I want to encourage you to throw a Levi party, to party with a purpose. You know, we have pool parties and dinner parties. You can have a game-watching party. I noticed that yesterday Fox Sports was saying this is the greatest sports weekend ever. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but, yesterday it was Penn State and Ohio State college football, the World Series. Today, the Cowboys and the Redskins, and then, the World Series again. I mean, it is a game watcher's paradise. Well, why not be more than a watcher? Why not be a witnesser? Or maybe, you get some flyers and you put them out in your community and you invite people to your house for a Bible study, and, you might be surprised at the number of people who would come. And if you do that, make sure it's not an uninviting atmosphere. Make sure it's a come-as-you-are kind of atmosphere. And you're not there to correct all the theological misstatements that might be floating around in the air. You're just welcoming people, encouraging people to take a look at Christ with you. I love what Anne Lamott said. You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. Now, you think about that. You can safely assume you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. You've created a false God. I thought about Jim and his wife who started coming to BridgeWay near the beginning of our launch years ago. And Jim, I had the privilege of baptizing Jim and his wife into Christ. It was great. But Jim was in advertising. And, of course, we needed a lot of help. And so he did some of the artwork for us. And that was great. And then we did a car show. so we could connect with outsiders, and he did some of the artwork for the car show. And it was great. But one Sunday afternoon, about 2 years into our launch, Jim called me, and he said, "Could you please come to my house?" So I went over to his house, and it was just Jim and a few sticks of furniture. That's it, just a bed and just a little bit of furniture, that's all, and a suitcase. His wife had left with their son. What I didn't know, and what Jim hadn't told me, was that he'd been smoking pot for a long time. And his wife had begged him to give up the habit, but he didn't want to do it. And so he just kind of kept smoking pot and kept acting in other ways that were really irresponsible. And finally, his wife just said, "I've had enough, I'm gone." And so she walked out. And she didn't come back. And, Jim struggled, but he kept coming to church, and we just kept loving him, kept showing him the love of Christ. And he's had kind of a rocky on and off relationship with God, but he's continued to seek after God. And just a few months ago, I get a text from Jim, and it's a picture of his son being baptized into Christ. And I thought, man, I'm sure glad we kept on loving Jim. I'm sure glad we kept on showing him the compassion of Christ. That's what we're called to do, to reach out to everybody. And if you think that everybody who walks in these doors on Sunday has a spotless spiritual resume, you need to think again. We're just sinners. We're just sinners, all of whom struggle. We all struggle. Some people with jealousy, some people with pride, some people with gossip, some people with greed, some people with all kinds of addictions, but we all just struggle, and we're here to, as fellow strugglers, to encourage each other and help each other along the way. There's a museum on Nantucket Island that's devoted to a volunteer organization that was formed years ago. Many, many years ago, travel along the East Coast was really dangerous, and all these ships would come in, and they would shipwreck on the shoals, and these people would be spilled into the water. And so the volunteer organization called themselves the Humane Society, and they built these little huts along the shore, and they would man the huts, and they would go out and they watch for people who were in danger of drowning. And they'd go out and they would save these people. But then over time, they decided to let the professionals do it. The Coast Guard came in, the Coast Guard assumed responsibility for all that, and so this society stopped manning the huts. They stopped watching for people who were lost and people who were drowning. But they couldn't bring themselves to stop meeting, and so even today, the Humane Society there on Nantucket still meets, and they have dinner parties, but they don't go out and save anybody. Last week, Kyle gave us a great message out of Ephesians 2. And he reminded us we've been saved from something, and we've been saved for something. And one of the four somethings that God has given us is the task of making sure that everybody we know gets to know Jesus Christ. Do you realize there are 300,000 people in Denton County who have no religious affiliation at all? And we want all those people to know that God loves them unconditionally. And we want all those people to know that there is an eternity, and they're going to face eternity with or without Christ. That's the most important assignment you and I have. Years ago, Paul Azinger was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 33. He just won the PGA championship. But here's what he said. "A genuine feeling of fear came over me. I could die from cancer. But then another reality hit me even harder. I'm going to die eventually anyway, whether from cancer or something else. Everything I had accomplished on the golf course became meaningless to me." And then he remembered something Larry Moody, another golfer, had told him. "Zinger, we're not in the land of the living going to the land of the dying. We're in the land of the dying trying to get to the land of the living. Every person you meet will spend eternity with or without God." So many people who maybe don't know Christ, they'll say, "Man, I love Christ. I love Jesus. But I just don't like the church. I love Jesus, but I just don't like Christians." And maybe one of the reasons sometimes people love Jesus but don't like the followers of Jesus is because the followers of Jesus are not always like Jesus. Do other people see the image of Christ in us? When they look at us, do they see somebody who's more like a Pharisee or somebody who's more like Jesus? See, Jesus was a champion of the misfits. He was a champion of the outcasts. And he was dedicated. He spent his time with the poor and the sick and the lepers and the lame and the morally broken and the people who considered themselves unloved by anybody else. And sometimes, we in the church have this way of separating ourselves, but Jesus comes up close. And he's proactive in coming close to the people who typically would be left out, and the people who are kicked to the curb, and the people who are ostracized, and the people who are shunned. Same Kind of Different as Me is a best-selling novel based on a true story. It's the story of Ron and Debbie Hall, who lived in Fort Worth. And Ron was an international art dealer, very, very successful, but he started cheating on Debbie. And when she found out, she said, "You can stay, provided that you tell me the truth and you do what it is that I ask you to do." And so he said, "Okay, I'll give it a try." She was going down to the Union Gospel Mission in Fort Worth and serving the homeless and the poor. And she said, "I want you to come with me." And he said, "I'll write a check, but I don't want to do that." But eventually he started going with her. And while they were in that process, they met Denver and a lot of other people who were really out there on the edges. And in the process of serving the needs of people who were on the edges, not only was their marriage restored, but they became much closer to Christ. I want you to open your worship guide this morning to the inside. I want you to look at the page, inside right page, listed November mission opportunities. I want you to just take a look at this. I mean, they're just a bukus of serving opportunities. November 4th is Samaritan Inn in McKinney. November 4 and 18, our women go down to the Salvation Army Ministry, and they meet with women who are coming out of prison, and they do crafts, and they play games, and they do wonderful things to share Christ with them. The same thing is true under Gary Nielsen's supervision with the men. Our students, Mission Denton Student Outreach, November the 5th. CCA Pantry, November 11. Our shoebox stuffing event for Operation Christmas Child, November 14. Then we got the mission trip to Restore Church in Blanchard. You can help build a stage for their worship center, this young church. And then again, Gary Nielsen leading the Filling the Void ministry, where you go downtown and you're feeding the homeless and you're providing a gospel tract for them. Now, I don't want you to continue to look at that. I want you to look right up here now, because I want your attention for a second, okay? But I want you to think about all the opportunities. If you are looking for a church that reaches out to people who are on the edges, you're going to be very hard-pressed to find a church that does more than BridgeWay Church. And you don't have any excuse. There's plenty of opportunities. So the question is, what are you going to do with those opportunities? And then I finally want you to think about Jesus. And I want you to think about what he did. Hebrews chapter 13 says that Jesus suffered outside the gates. He suffered outside the camp. Do you know what that means? He was taken outside the gates of the city wall, where the most notorious criminals were taken, where the people who were considered to be the ultimate misfits, they were taken and they were stripped naked. And then, as Charles reminded us this morning, they were crucified, and then people walked by and made fun of them. And I can almost imagine people walking by Jesus and saying the same people that some of those bullies said to Lady Gaga. "What are you going to do, cry? You're pathetic." And just imagine all the other epithets that were tossed in Jesus' direction. But he goes outside the camp because he loves you and he loves me. If he can save me, he can save anybody. He loved the misfits of the world, that's you and me, enough to die for us. And then he rose from the dead to say, guess what? If you put your faith in me, you can overcome the power of sin and death. That's what he did for you. How extravagant will your love be for him? Let's bow and pray.